This would be a fine thing if we could start something in terms of regional cooperation.
Навзаєм.
Welcome to the Barents Observer.
Thank you very much.
You have a long background in Norwegian-Russian diplomatic relations. Let's go 30 years back in time. How important was it for Norway to establish regional contacts with Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union?
I think it was a very important thing, and particularly for, the government and for the foreign minister at the time, Mr. Thorvald Stoltenberg. He saw that new possibilities opened it up for building confidence, cooperation across the border, which had, for all practical purposes, long time been more or less closed. Only a few official delegations and a few sportsmen would travel across the border up here in the north. So this was a new chance, and Mr. Stoltenberg took the opportunity to go ahead, and his initiative bore fruits.
You were kind of inspired by the speech of Mikhail Gorbachev in Murmansk.
I think it's important to remember that when the Norwegian government and the foreign minister took this initiative way back in 1992, also important people had charted the course before that. And I was rereading, coming down to Kirkenes on the plane today, I was rereading the speech given by Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, I believe on the 1st of October 1987. It's a visionary speech. And it says a lot about, nuclear-free zones up here in the north, about restrictions on naval operations, and then also very much on regional cooperation and on environmental protection. Actually, I believe that Gorbachev was one of those that kind of sowed the grains for what would later on become a very practical, for many years, regional cooperation.
But in the foreign ministry in Oslo, after Gorbachev's speech, how was the reactions? This was new words from...
It was very much new thinking. And this is also what Gorbachev used to say, that we now need new thinking. We cannot go by the old standards and so on. We have to, in the new world, we have to think also in different terms from before. Of course, when there's a big change like that, when something very new is happening, the Soviet Union was changing before our eyes every day, just about. It was kind of unraveling. It was so dramatic, and of course this also would lead to us asking questions. What should we do now? What would be the best way to respond to this, and so on? So it was a very interesting time, a very, how should I say, creative time. People had to also adapt to these new conditions and start thinking for themselves, what can we do to respond to all the new things that are happening? And this was very much also what we were preoccupied with in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Oslo way back in those days.
And then you took one of the Norwegian Air Force's smaller planes, and you actually flew to Murmansk.
I will never forget. In April 1992, I was asked by the foreign minister, my boss, Mr. Thorvald Stoltenberg, to fly together with a colleague, Sverre Jervel, all the way to Murmansk, and to pick up and accompany two distinguished Soviet officials, or rather by that time Russian officials, being the governor of Murmansk, Mr. Komarov, and the deputy governor of Arkhangelsk, Mr. Yefremov, bring them to Tromsø. And there was a meeting with Thorvald Stoltenberg where he launched this idea of a regional cooperation in the northern area, including Russia, of course, and Sweden and Finland. And the response was very positive, and this was very much kind of the starting point for the process that followed and led to the signing of the Kirkenes Declaration exactly 30 years ago.
That opened up for
Absolutely.
Huge cross-border cooperation.
Absolutely.
And later turned out to be one of Norway's most important foreign policies.
Yes. Actually, I seem to remember that in just about any kind of new government's declaration when it regards foreign policy. There will be a statement to the effect that the policies of the government on northern affairs is the most important foreign policy dimension of Norway for the time being. That is in this or that government's kind of political overall statement. So yes, very much. And the focus on the northern areas as it is, and especially the Barents Cooperation, was and remained for a long time a very important part of Norwegian overall foreign policy.
But when
a peace project, it was called a peace and confidence project, and rightly so.
And let's move to a different part of the former Soviet Union, because when this Barents Cooperation Declaration was signed, you were ambassador in Kiev, the first Norwegian ambassador to Ukraine. Give us a glance of how was Russian-Ukrainian relations back in 1993?
Well, at that time, actually, they were quite normal. Of course, this was immediately after the outbreak of the Soviet Union. I arrived as ambassador there in September 1992. Mr. Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich had sat down before the TV cameras in the Kremlin on the 25th of December 1991 and declared the end of the Soviet Union. So, of course, everybody was asking in Ukraine, in Russia, what now? What's going to happen? What are we going to be? What kind of a policy are we going to have? Ukraine, for example, are we going to lean westwards, or are we going to lean towards our old mentors, as it were, to Russia? Or what's going to be our foreign policy or our vision of our future policy in general? What are we going to be? And this was... for this reason, this was a very interesting, to say the least of it, time to be there. Of course, we had very modest, when it comes to the practicalities, there was next to nothing. But in terms of seeing this big European, the second biggest country in Europe, trying to come to grips with its newborn independence, this was a unique experience, which I would never have been without. So this was a great time, a special time, and the relations between the two countries at the time were very normal and, well, good.
And for Norway, the former Soviet republics, several of them were important. We have had embassies in Kazakhstan, in Azerbaijan, of course the Baltic countries, in addition to Ukraine. Why such focus from the Norwegian authorities to the former Soviet republics? Well,
for one thing, of course, the Soviet Union was and Russia remains a neighbor to Norway. So we have a border which is like nearly 198 kilometers long. Compared to the border of next door Finland, of course, this is not very much. And Ukraine has a border with Russia, I think, more than 2,000 kilometers. But still, we are neighbors. And we've had a good relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union. At the time of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, at least we had kind of a rational relationship. There wasn't much of a contact, but we had a rational relationship. And actually, Russians used to tell me when I was ambassador in Moscow for 9 years that Norway is the only neighboring country with which we have never been at war. So we have this legacy, you can say, from the history of having a good relationship. And then when it comes to the other countries that you mentioned, in Central Asia, for example, well, this is a huge region. Kazakhstan is, I believe, the 8th or 9th largest country in the world, small population, rich in resources. So why shouldn't we be represented there? We had an embassy, it's been closed now, and I used to be ambassador also when we were in Moscow, because we did not have an own embassy at the time in Astana. But we had an embassy for a while there, and this, of course, is a very in resources, rich oil, you name it, and so an important country. The 8th or 9th largest in the world.
You were ambassador to Moscow for 8 years, and most likely the most prospective 8 years in Norwegian-Russian relations for business, for culture, cooperation, education, people-to-people, environment, etc. The war on Ukraine started in 2014, but what were your first thoughts when you wake up in the morning of 24th of February 2022 with a massive war between those two countries?
Yeah, it was a shock. It was very much a shock to wake up in the morning of the 24th of February last year. I was here in Kirkenes at the time. Of course, we had been kind of forewarned for a long time because we could see that things were happening, that military forces were gathering on the border to Ukraine, and the pressure was always there on Ukraine and on the West to kind of discuss with Moscow what to do about this. So in that sense, with the enormous deployment of forces, military forces on the border with Ukraine, so it wasn't kind of, a very big surprise. Many actually said that this had been more or less expected. But to all of us who had worked there and so on, this was a shock to wake up on that morning and see that a country in which I had spent so many years of my life as ambassador, and also before that in our foreign service, and attacking an independent, I'd say innocent country, that of Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe, which I had come to respect. And well, I had a very fruitful time there when I was ambassador way back in the beginning of the 1990s. This was, of course, to us on the personal side and as a professional and so on, this was a great shock and a great tragedy that befell Ukraine first and foremost, but actually both countries and the whole of Europe. But to both these countries, of course, and to the people of these two countries, not only a shock, but a great tragedy.
How does the war influence what is left of Norwegian-Russian cooperation?
Well, today, when I was ambassador there from 2000 until 2009 nearly, we had literally half the Norwegian government visiting Moscow every year. There would be a number of delegations just about every week. The three biggest Norwegian military schools, the War Academy and the Staff College and this Academy of the Military Forces of Norway. They all visited Russia at the time, and there was a very big exchange of not only delegations. Trade was picking up. Confidence was growing all the time. The Barents cooperation was, unfolding. So this was way back in the beginning of the early days of the 21st century. And we all had this feeling of a kind of convergence. This was the catchword of the time, convergence, that the ideas, the values, and the outlook on the world of the Western world and of the Russians and the Eastern Europeans would kind of converge, and that we would, be able to join hands and cooperate and build the confidence so as to prevent conflicts in the future. This was not to work out like that, and for this reason, as I say, when we then, many years later, 20 years later, wake up and see what is happening and so on, this is of course something that has made it very difficult today to maintain a relationship with Russia, apart from the more formal aspects. There's literally there's not much trade because of the sanctions and all that. And the political dialogue also is very limited. What we have up here in the north are a few instances of what is still there. That is, the cooperation in the field of fisheries, very vital to both countries. That's the reason why they persist and continue, because both to Russia and to Norway, keeping up the good cooperation in the field of fisheries, worth billions of not only kroner but dollars to both countries every year. As you may remember, the quota for the cod, which is now, it used to be, actually there was 1 year, 2017, 1 million tons. 1 million tons, this is 1 billion kilos, and you pay the fishermen like 40 kilos per kilo. This is enormous, It's very important to Norway and to Russia. But beyond that, sadly, very little is happening in Norwegian-Russian terms these days, but we try to keep kind of, at least a minimum of contacts, and should do so.
You spent a few years as Norway's consul general in Murmansk, and the consulate is now closed?
Yeah, the consulate is closed. As I understand it, it's closed for the time being. That is, it has been not entirely kind of taken out of the diplomatic system of Norway. So maybe one fine day, hopefully, there will be possibilities for reopening. To see such an opportunity today is literally impossible. But hopefully one day, because we here up in the north, we share a border with Russia. They live on the other side and we live here. And we should do everything we can to avoid that we will be two countries kind of staring at each other through the binoculars or the military and so on. We should try to keep a contact, and hopefully one fine day, I have no illusions, but one fine day it will be possible to get together again and to build a genuine cooperation, confidence and trust.
Because one should think that maintaining diplomatic contact, diplomatic channels, is even more important in times of trouble than in normal business days. This first Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs under Boris Yeltsin, who signed this Barents Cooperation Agreement, Mr. Andrei Kozyrev.
Yes.
He was in media quite soon after Russia's massive attack in February on Ukraine, calling on all Russian diplomats to quit their post in protest. Do you understand such a statement?
Well, yes, he lives in, I believe he lives abroad, and I also noticed his statement to this effect. Yes, I can understand that. There have also been a few cases of Russian diplomats. There was one in Geneva that kind of stepped out of the line and was very critical of the war. I can understand that. And, well, I can only say that for us in the West, and in Norway in particular, we being a neighboring country to Russia, and having had very positive feelings about our relationship with Russia during the last few decades. For us, of course, to observe what is now happening when it comes to the war, and also internally in Russia, the possibilities to engage with Russians, the civil society of Russia, the press, for example, and so on. This is disheartening, very disheartening for us. And so hopefully a day will come when we will be able to re-engage.
What is needed in Moscow in order to re-engage?
Well, there will have to be a change of thinking. Like Gorbachev used to say, "Нам нужно новое мышление." That's what is needed very much. We have to look at each other as partners. This is easy to say. This is difficult to do. But we have to look at each other as partners, as neighbors. And I have been reading as of late again George Orwell's 1984. Now, in 1984, the world is made up of three superpowers, which are continually, eternally at war with each other. And we must, I don't think there is actually a risk that that's going to happen, but you see some contours of something like that, of eternal struggles and internal confrontation and conflict and so on. And we must do everything that we can to avoid that. We must hope that that Russia will understand that we are not here. It has been stated over again also by Western leaders. We are not there to change the government of Russia, to have any regime change. But we want, to have a change in the way that Russia reacts to West, to the ideas that they and we stand for, at least in principle and so on. And if we can get to such a point, then I hope that we will be able again to start a dialogue which can lead to something better than what we have now, where there is this constant, confrontation and this standoff all the time. But it will not be easy.
Mr. Nordsletten, you're a true diplomat. Thank you very much for joining us here at the Barents Observer.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And for all our subscribers, The link to the Barents Observer is underneath this video. Follow us.